amazing to be here at Radio TechCon today. I'm truly delighted to be asked to come along and talk to you about this subject, which affects so many people in the UK, many of whom may not even realise they're impacted by hearing loss. I work as a hearing therapist and advisory consultant, and my reason for being is that when someone encounters deafness in their life, it can have a widespread consequence for them. It can affect their health, their mental health, their sense of self, their relationships with others, their ability to sustain livelihoods. The list goes on. So my job as a hearing therapist is to come in and help unpick some of the issues that are arising, help them navigate their way through, and help them in the process of adjustment and change against each of the dimensions in which they're operating. So I'm hugely passionate about this work because hearing loss and deafness have wide-ranging impacts and affect so many people in the world today. And an important underpinning that I bring to all of the work that I do is I myself lost my hearing in childhood. And I'll give you a small glimpse into that later on in my talk. So as with the other discussions today, it will be quite rapid, but I will start by giving you some deeper insights into the practicalities of living with hearing loss or deafness, which I hope will help you to gain a deeper understanding of what this might mean for you as broadcast engineers and program makers who are looking to reach the widest possible audience that you can to its greatest effect. And I will leave you with some simple suggestions to get the conversation going about the types of things that you might like to consider in your program making and your broadcasts that will help you to reach some of these audience members who are impacted by reduced hearing. So the first place that I'd like to start is with this commonly held belief that deafness is just going to be something that happens when we get older. I'm not going to challenge that belief, it is true. But age-related hearing loss, presbycusis, is not a sudden onset condition. For the majority of people, it will be something that starts much younger in their life. And the RNID, the Royal National Institute for the Deaf, which is one of the leading charities representing the interests of deaf people, suggests that over 40% of those over 50 years of age have a degree of hearing loss or deafness, and that by the age of 70, over 70% of the population are affected. So you can see there's a huge number at a younger age and then an exponential growth. However, what I also want to point out is that hearing loss can happen to anyone at any stage of their life. If you consider infection, illness, blunt force traumas, disorders of the hearing system, explosions, I think once you particularly consider the global picture, it's much more easy to begin to understand why someone may encounter a degree of deafness in their life at some stage. In terms of total numbers, as David mentioned, we're looking at around 12 million people in the UK impacted by a degree of hearing loss, deafness, or tinnitus. But globally, the World Health Organization suggests 1.5 billion are affected. And universally, reports are showing that these numbers are increasing steadily. Just something to adjunct the UK figures that I just want to mention is that we're tending to see hearing loss being detected at a younger age than we were before. But because the retirement age is also rising, there's now an increased likelihood that someone can encounter hearing loss or deafness while they're still a working age. I think that's quite relevant to bear in mind. Now, to give you one point in case with regards to deafness and how it can appear in someone's life, a little glimpse into my story. So, some photos from the family album, and this never ceases to amaze me, this marvellous monobrow that I'm displaying here. And, I mean, where to start with the sideburns? not random photos at all. They show me at the age of 1, 3, and 5. These were the ages that childhood hearing screening were undertaken in those days, and I sailed through. And I was also actually, from the speech and language perspective, developmentally advanced. So I was reading by 3, writing by 4. And I also actually have my first conscious recollection of musical chills, which, because I remember the song that I was singing to at the time, places me at around the age of 3 or 4. And I attribute that in part to this lady here on the right, who's my mother, and she was a classically trained musician in India. So music was always part of my background at home. So given this scenario, nothing could have prepared us for what was going to happen next. Another pertinent picture from the album, and this one really shows the point in time that we discovered I wasn't hearing. And the story that I'm told, because I actually don't remember this myself, is that I was out playing as usual with my friends, and my mother came out of the house to call me in for dinner one day. And she says, "I will never forget that day. I called you in, and you were the only one in the group that didn't turn around to look at me. I still had my back to her because I hadn't heard her." And I believe what happened after that was I was whisked off to doctors for hearing tests and then repeat hearing tests, which I do remember. And I think the belief was, or the hope rather, was that perhaps an infection had set in and that this was a temporary issue. But it wasn't to be. And the rest, as they say, is history. So all we know at that point, at least, was that at some stage between the age of 5 and 9, I had developed a significant hearing loss. Now, when someone detects that there's an issue with their hearing, they may not be the first person to notice it. Others around them may pick up on it first, and they may be encouraged to go for a hearing test. Now, when someone attends an audiology clinic or an ENT clinic or any other hearing care setting, and they attend for a hearing test, what we are measuring are their thresholds of hearing. And the way that we do this is that we give them a set of headphones and a clicker, and we present to them a series of tones measured across the horizontal, going from lower tones to higher pitches, measured in hertz, and we vary the volume, measured in decibels of sound pressure level, going from soft to progressively louder. And the tones that we give them are the formant tones that appear in speech. And the speech range is this range here, the blue shaded range, which we call the speech banana. This is a blank audiogram, by the way. It doesn't have anyone's test on it. But this line here at the top at 20 dBs marks the upper limit of normal. So if people respond to the test and we are able to plot a graph for them that falls at 20 dB or softer, they're considered to have normal thresholds of hearing. And when their graph starts to fall beneath 20 dBs, then we're seeing some evidence of reduced thresholds of hearing. So as one example here, we've got something known as a cookie bite loss because of the depression in the middle. This is congenital loss, perhaps someone who was born with this hearing loss or someone who developed it at an earlier age. But there are as many audiograms as there are people. There are just some specific patterns that we sometimes see. The next one, for instance, is a fairly classic case of age-related hearing loss, presbycusis. Presbycusis tends to affect the higher pitch tones in speech more, earlier and more severely than the lower tones, which is why we get this gentle tailing off or sloping appearance in the graph. So this person, for instance, has quite a mild to moderate case of presbycusis. They still have a good range of the speech banana within their audible thresholds, but the area above their graph, which is outside their audible threshold, is really the right-hand side of the speech banana, which is the softer, high-pitched tones in speech, which lend the clarity to what people say. So this person may have good access to speech still, but they might have misunderstandings, or they might feel that people are mumbling because it doesn't sound quite as clear as they would like. The next audiogram shows a completely different picture. This is obviously someone with quite significantly reduced thresholds. They're only really picking up very loud, low-frequency environmental noise, and actually they had no responses over 2 kilohertz. Okay, so these are people who've got the headphones on and they're not pressing the button at all. Now, without any further information about the history of this person, I would be tempted to suggest that if they were born with this level of reduced threshold of hearing, that they may never have had good access to speech at all, and they may have developed or adopted sign language as their first language, and they may identify it as being capital D, deaf. In terms of numbers, these are a smaller section of the 12 million, and I believe the figures are currently around 87,000 in the UK. But the audiogram is very useful for giving us some visibility over the thresholds of hearing, how loud something needs to be for someone to start to register that sound. But what it doesn't tell us is what their auditory perception is. Now, auditory perception is the way in which we organise and make sense of what we're hearing. Now, clearly, there's a relationship between sound and auditory perception, because if you have reduced thresholds of hearing, you have less sound entering the auditory system, so your perception is going to be challenged. However, the extent to which auditory perception can be maintained by someone, and it varies considerably. So, for instance, in my case, my reduced thresholds of hearing went undetected for quite some time because it probably developed slowly in the background. And as it was developing, I was coming online without being aware of it with tactics like lip reading, face washing, paying good attention to what's being said and using knowledge of context of the discussion to help me make sound of what I was hearing. So many variables that can affect someone's auditory perception when they have reduced thresholds. Hearing aids can make a difference, but again, is the person using hearing aids? Are they using one? Are they using two? What kind of level of sophistication are those devices? If they're listening to the TV or radio, how are those devices interfacing with the audio output device? So there are many things that can make a difference to auditory perception when thresholds are reduced. But one thing that is almost universal amongst anyone who has got a reduced threshold of hearing is the environment in which they're listening or their listening context. So, for instance, if I was in a quiet room having a conversation with any one of you, and the lighting is good, and I'm lip reading you well, and we don't have any distractions around us, visual or audible, you probably won't even notice that I have got a significant hearing loss because my auditory perception in that situation will be very good. However, if I then took you out to the Maxwell Library and attempted to have a conversation with you over a cup of tea against the background of speech babble that we have, then my auditory perception is now likely to be massively influenced by the background noise. Because if you remember from the audiogram, environmental noise quite often remains audible while someone's access to the speech range has been reduced. So I'm now having to filter through the background noise to listen to what you're saying. And my opportunity for lip reading may also be hampered by inadequate lighting or perhaps the food and drink that we're consuming. So there's many challenges taking place in that dynamic listening environment, even though I haven't changed, my hearing thresholds haven't changed. So for that reason, everyday listening environments, which include TV and radio, are often some of the earliest markers that we have that someone is having a difficulty with their hearing. And you may actually be a little bit surprised to discover that actually this question, does a hearing problem cause you difficulty in listening to the TV or radio, is quite a common question to appear quite early on in any form of psychometric or other evaluation of someone's hearing. And the reason why TV and radio do appear quite high up on the radar is because they quite often portray everyday listening environments, and we've seen some fantastic examples of that in the discussions earlier today with the live reporting and so forth. So what does that mean for us as broadcast engineers, program makers, in terms of our service outputs and what we're trying to do here? Well, firstly, I think the first thing that we can recognize is that the number of people in your audience that you may not be reaching effectively, or that you are reaching but may need to consider future-proofing for, is not a small number. 12 million in the UK, reaching billions globally. So that's a large cohort of your audience, your potential audience. But there's something else that I'd really personally like to get across as well that may be slightly less obvious to you. And that is that because everyday listening environments are so challenging for people who've got reduced thresholds of hearing because of the impact on their auditory perception, the natural tendency they have is to withdraw. And social isolation amongst deaf people is widely accepted and quite well researched as well. So I feel that radio and audio broadcasting has a huge role to play in keeping these people connected by bringing the outside world in for them. So making news, education, information, entertainment, laughter and joy accessible to these people adds a significant attribute of quality to their life. And I think actually your capacity to do this is quite enormous, because the building blocks for auditory perception, which is sound itself, is something that you're working with every day, so it's vastly within your control. So on that note, I'd like to leave you with a few simple suggestions, but I'm going to have to go through very quickly at the moment, as we're running out of time. I think there's two main aspects that you could go away and think about right from tomorrow. The first thing is to think about how much noise, extraneous noise, may be entering the picture when you're delivering your broadcast. Remember, people with reduced thresholds are having to work hard through concentration to filter out extraneous noise to get to the softer speech sounds. So if there's any noise that's entering the system, whether it's deliberate or not, you may need to consider what the impact could be for a deaf person who's listening. So I'd like to give you a very simple example of this. If you have a piece of music that's about to start playing, is the presenter introducing that song or that piece while the music has already started? If they have, music occupies a much broader range and intensity level than speech. It can very easily occlude what the presenter is saying, and what they're delivering gives very important contextual information to the listener about the noise or the music or the sound that's about to start. In terms of delivery styles, again, do we have one person speaking or do we have overlapping chatter? And how can that be managed? These are very simple suggestions to get you to think about how you can assist rather than work against the auditory perception of your deaf audience. And a key question to ask yourself is this communication likely to have been successful? So that's all I really have time for today. Large subjects, hearing loss, deafness, auditory perception, they are topics in their own right. But I hope that that's enough to get your juices flowing with regards to how you might like to try and reach as wide an audience as you can, including those with reduced thresholds of hearing going forward. I welcome any questions. You're also welcome to keep in touch with me. And you may also like to learn more from my forthcoming module on hearing and music, which is due next year.
Excellent.
Thank you for listening.